Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Red and Blue Rescue Team were released in Japan in 2005 as a continuation of the Mystery Dungeon anthology of games. Starting with Torneco's Great Adventure in 1993, the Chunsoft-developed Mystery Dungeon titles all have to do with pretty similar premises, and it's all implied in the title Mystery Dungeon. A roguelike, dungeon-crawling, randomized experience with high replay value. Red and Blue Rescue Team were the first foray into the Pokémon Mystery Dungeon spin-off series, an adaptation of Mystery Dungeon in a Pokémon-exclusive society, and one of the many attempts of Nintendo to use the Pokémon franchise's success to monopolize every genre of video game. Ethical implications of Game Freak's monopolizing aside, Red and Blue Rescue Team are still two pretty well-made video games, and their successor is literally my favorite game of all time. Back before Pokemon games were optimized for the Samsung Smart Fridge, and before the games had storylines that amounted to force-feeding underdeveloped ideas and themes at a player in hopes that they'll forget what it means to write a comprehensive narrative, spin-off Pokemon games were consistently interesting, intuitive, and moraled. Playing these games as an adult, I know that I'm no longer the target audience when there are anti-bullying and emotional regularity life lessons put in front of me, because I've already committed my life to being an impulsive bully, and a big portion of my ability to appreciate these games is steeped in nostalgia because I'm not the target audience. But there's something to be said objectively for the people who worked on these teams having a creative vision and executing it to completion, even if it is a game for kids. I might just be a cynic who doesn't understand the passage of time and our different connection to things as we grow older, but I really feel like as video games have become such a gargantuan industry, the ability for a concise, comprehensively executed game by a small company has faded, and now we either get storylines that absolutely insist upon themselves, or have literally no statement to make whatsoever in hopes of appealing to the most broad audience possible. Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Red and Blue Rescue Team, to be clear, are not Shakespearean narratives of mortality and love that define what it means to be in a world insistent on not being. I mean, to me, they kind of are, but as you'll find out, I love to imbue meaning in things that there probably isn't meaning. If we extracted all the text from the game and asked ChatGPT to summarize the plot, it would be something like the following. If I were a real YouTuber, I would actually ask ChatGPT, but I'm a fraud and you're not getting a real sub-story in my second video, maybe the third. A human wakes up and is shocked to find out they have turned into a Pokemon. This character, the protagonist of the game, meets a Pokemon who is a little naive but extremely optimistic, and who asks the protagonist to form a rescue team. Together, they take on quests and build a connection despite how dubious the human-turned-Pokemon protagonist's origins are, working together to uncover the mystery of a string of natural disasters that have started popping up around the world. The protagonist begins seeing strange apparitions when they're sleeping, hinting at their past in vague, indecipherable clues from a mysterious Pokemon, Gardevoir, who knows them from their time as a human. Eventually, an antagonist, the Pokemon Gengar, spreads a rumor that the world is being destroyed because of the protagonist being turned into a human after betraying their partner Pokemon, causing a massive witch hunt that leads the human Pokemon and their rescue team ally to be fugitives. After escaping deep into the wilderness, they find evidence that the witch hunt is based on a fabrication, and they return to the town they were expelled from. The town believes and trusts that the protagonist and their partner are telling the truth despite the lack of evidence, and they're absolved. The natural disasters continue to regress, culminating in a cataclysmic meteor spotted cascading towards the planet, which will likely destroy Pokémon-kind. The human-turned-Pokemon protagonist and their partner Pokemon, having been tested by the events of the game, are trusted to save the world by going into the sky and persuading a legendary dragon, Rayquaza, to destroy the meteor. They succeed, convince Rayquaza, and destroy the meteor, and they, despite having been caught up in the blast, survive because Gengar, who acts as the ferry between the living world and the dead, decides to spare them as his final redemptive act. The protagonist begins to fade from the world because it's revealed they were turned into a Pokemon purely to prevent the world's disaster, causing their partner to break down and all the Pokemon they've met along the way to mourn them just the same. After the credits roll, the protagonist is brought back to the Pokemon world through the resolve of both the partner and the protagonist to be reunited with one another. I consider the story as complete here because this is when the credits roll, and I feel like the Pokémon Mystery Dungeon games have a tendency to cheapen their own narratives by endlessly compounding on their own themes in the post-game. For context, in the post-game, Gengar gets redeemed for a second time when he reveals that he was the human who betrayed his partner Pokemon Gardevoir, and he apologizes and makes it up to Gardevoir, and all of that, but I feel like the self-contained, succinct story represented before the credits roll is more potent and easier to analyze for its simplicity. So what is the game about outside of its synopsis? There are three main categories I want to talk about that sort of work towards the main one, and I feel like this is where I'll probably lose my friends who are watching this video when they start telling me, once again, I'm reading too much into nothing. The first theme that I see in this game is climate and the world. Outside of Gengar and his manipulation causing the protagonist and the partner character to be exiled, the central conflict of the game comes from the impending destruction of the planet. Natural disasters had been ramping up from before the protagonist even enters the Pokemon world, and the partner character's primary motivation to create a rescue team from the first meeting is to find a solution and prevent the calamity. The mystery dungeons in the game, too, the main barrier to progress from a gameplay and storyline perspective, are explained in story as emergent from the consistent natural disasters. Literally, dungeons full of violence, and we will get to Pokemon violence later, beings that you have to navigate through to make it forward are the crux of the gameplay, and they're entirely caused by this change in climate. And the final scene of the game, where they ascend to the Sky Tower to destroy a meteor, laying their lives on the line for the sake of the world, demonstrates this theme in one of the most concise ways. They will risk everything, including themselves, to save the world. There's a level of planetary stewardship and environmentalism to the Pokemon universe in the Pokemon Blue Rescue Team game's narrative that underscores all of the lessons on friendship, dependence, and community. When the protagonist is exiled from Treasure Town at the midpoint of the game, it is entirely a product of this climate conflict. After all, the town does not enjoy being forced to eliminate the protagonist, but the needs of the world, and indeed all Pokemon who depend on that world, take precedent over any individual life. All of these Pokemon are immediately joined in the fight to protect the world and eliminate any threat to it, even if it is one of their friends. I'd even say there's an element of mutuality or duality to the planet and the Pokemon's life that the game builds. The final scene immediately post-credits has the protagonist, who had disappeared from the Pokemon universe for having completed their role, brought back in a flash of light bubbles to rejoin the community they were forced to leave. As much as it's a type of friendship is magic deus ex machina between the protagonist and their partner, I have to also read this as the life of the world and the life of the world's stewards being inexorably linked to each other, such that by providing life to the world, by rescuing the world from the face of disaster, the world is able to provide that life back to the protagonist. After all, who speaks to the protagonist in that cutscene, asking them to wish for their body back in order to get it? We could say it's the partner Pokemon, or Gardevoir, or some legendary Pokemon yet unintroduced in this generation who had control of time or space or everything. But I think it's beautiful to think that just as the world began to destroy Pokemon kind, so too does it have the ability to create Pokemon kind in opposition. We can even stretch a little bit further and demonstrate it in the Pokemon houses that the protagonist lives in, one designed for each possible protagonist. I want to quickly acknowledge that the partner character just gave this house to the protagonist for free and lives somewhere else off-screen themselves. Are you okay? The real estate value of a house located right next to the town plaza and the rescue board, when you're a rescue team member, it's probably super high. The partner isn't about their money at all. Anyway, the house is initially just a little hovel with hay bales in it, but eventually becomes remodeled into an oversized depiction of the player character's head, after enlisting gluttonous monkey construction workers to develop it. From this, I have to ask, what is home as both a concept and as a literal thing in the game? All of it has to be the self. If the protagonist is its own singularized home in the midst of the collective of the world, we can assume that the corporeal body is a means and a vehicle to achieve biradial aetherology, which then acquiesces to the inordinate anomaly. It is thus that the concupiscent clearance of idiosyncrasy is pulchritudinous in its ebullient simplicity. We displace that which does not serve us, and we are served in kind by the absence. Just kidding, I'm trolling. The last few sentences were nonsense that meant nothing. But I really think there is a metaphorical connection with a home, a little root in the earth, a building which signifies belonging and place, being modeled after the protagonist's face in a game about climate resistance. The protagonist's home, which evolves from a modest hovel to a grand structure resembling their face, has to symbolize their growing connection to the world. The transformation of their home reflects the protagonist's role in preserving the planet and their eventual reintegration into the community. And when the protagonist is swallowed into the light and then spat back out by the world at the end of the game, it is at the site of the home, where the partner is seen mourning outside. The body is a site of the world. It's why each Pokemon you recruit to your rescue team stays at a friend's area that matches their vibe too. Despite being able to exist anywhere, being able to live anywhere, there's a mutuality to the body and the planet. And by protecting the planet, all of the bodies of the world are linked together. All of the Pokemon are joined in the fight for the world because, in a way, they are the world. The next angle that I examine this game from is the theme of crime and criminality. As much as there's a theme of collectivity in the game, it's underscored by the sort of separation that we see in Pokemon society. Fundamental to the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon franchise is the idea of the rescue team. There's literally no compelling force for the player to exist in the world, other than as the partner of the rescue team obsessed deuteragonist. And at the most basic level, if I had to compare the role of the rescue team to an occupation in the real world, it would have to be a police force of some kind. It's not a perfect one-to-one comparison, in part because only half the tasks we do involve policing, and also because it's more of a vigilante justice system. There's no formalized carceral end for criminals, at least not until Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Explorers of Time, Darkness, Sky, so it seems that we mainly just deliver justice by beating people up and then leaving. So in there being no carceral system, is this pseudo-policing occupation absolved of its toxicity? No. In order for us to analyze crime, we have to analyze what the game shows us are quote-unquote criminals. These are Pokemon, just like the protagonist, deuteragonist, and every relevant NPC in town, in Mystery Dungeons who we are told are irate or feral in some way. And so the protagonist and deuteragonist venture off into these dungeons to locate the wanton thieves and belligerent beasts and enact quote-unquote justice, retrieving the stolen item or purging the wildness out of them by force. And in doing that, we have to tap into how crime, how ferality, how wildness emerges in the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon world. The game tries to explain away Pokemon misbehavior by saying the natural disasters make them erratic. And we see confirmation of this throughout the game when the legendary birds attack the player's team just because they dared to wander nearby at the same time as natural disasters were happening, and thus must be responsible, right? But it's a stretch, and one I don't think the game wants us to make, to say that all these quote-unquote criminal Pokemon are behaving abnormally just because of the natural disasters. What would drive any Pokemon to steal an item belonging, supposedly, to another, such that a rescue team would have to put themselves in a vigilante position and chase down that item? What would drive any Pokemon to attack other Pokemon who walk upon them in a dungeon? Supposedly, the idea of ferality, which separates tame, well-behaving Pokemon from those wandering the mystery dungeons. But what does it mean to be feral in this context? The term itself implies wild, uncontrollable behavior, positioning these Pokemon as antagonistic forces of immorality that could never coexist in the way the Pokemon living in the town coexist. Yet when we look closer, we see that these feral Pokemon are no different from those living in the town. They follow their instincts, protect their territories, and seek to survive, just like any other Pokemon. Were they fundamentally opposed to the player character and the domestic living Pokemon of the town, they wouldn't be recruitable. How can we posit that these Pokemon are feral and also say that it is possible for them to become functional members of the rescue team? As aforementioned, Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Blue and Red Rescue Team offers a unique perspective on the Pokemon world. Here, you're not a trainer like in traditional games. You play the role of a Pokemon, tasked with rescuing others and maintaining order in a world where Pokemon live independently from human influence. And in that reversal of tradition, this game's world building relies on an understanding that there's no embedded species hierarchy of human and animal, wherein humans are responsible to create or destroy society, and Pokemon act as a guest in the role of stewardship of that society. So, to create conflict, the narrative recreates hierarchy in this society where there probably would not be otherwise. The Pokemon in Treasure Town and those deemed feral are fundamentally the same. The difference lies only in their circumstances. Feral Pokemon are not inherently evil, they're simply outside the structured society of Treasure Town, and kept that way by the residents of Treasure Town. By labeling them villains and acting themselves as enforcers, the rescue teams impose an arbitrary sense of order, criminalizing natural behavior and positing their own superiority. And when you recruit a quote-unquote feral Pokemon and bring them with you to the town, it is almost akin to a human trainer toting a Pokemon, a tamed animal, along with them as they experience some grand adventure as in the main game. This, of course, brings us to the issue of jurisdiction and the morality of the game's narrative hierarchy. As a player character, you have no inherent authority to take on the role of a rescuer enforcer other than what the game's narrative gives you. But the player could and should raise questions about why they get to decide what is lawful or criminal in this Pokemon-only society, and why it's all protagonist-lensed if this society supposedly existed before and will exist after the protagonist's absence. What does it mean that the protagonist goes into dungeons, attacks Pokemon in their own home, indoctrinates them to fight on behalf of the protagonist's rescue team, and then revokes their autonomy in service of the rescue team's goals? The framing of this game seems to think of itself as a standard tale of good and bad, but it never seeks to put itself in the shoes of the bad party like any such narrative should. Why is there no NPC who is a feral Pokemon? Why is there no NPC who comes from a mystery dungeon? It's all a question that the game sort of leaves hanging. We cannot understand how power and socialization functions in a Pokemon-organized society without understanding this hierarchy, and yet there is one other lens we can evaluate what we do have through to draw some conclusions. So the next lens that I use to analyze Pokemon Mystery Dungeon is sex and gender. Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Blue Rescue Team has one major difference to the standard mainline games that I haven't acknowledged, and it's one of the most standard facts of the Pokemon universe. Pokemon in mainline games are sexed as either male or female, with some minor sex differences visible on some Pokemon. I say sexed and not gendered because Pokemon are not socially advocating as any particular gender, and gender and sex are not the same thing. Do not fight me in the comments over this. I'm not arguing science with people who get their tests handed back face down. The sex differences we see are usually just minor aesthetic things, like Pikachu having a rectangular tail when it's male versus female Pikachu having a heart-shaped tail. Sex is a biological condition of anatomy at birth, and gender, but separately from that, is a sociocultural construct where people are given social roles loosely derived from their sex. Gail Rubin described the theory of a sex-gender system. In the human context, she said, quote, "It is the set of arrangements by which a society transforms biological sexuality into products of human activity," end quote. In other words, sex is a fixed and factual, biological, anatomically evident fact. Gender is how that fixed sex becomes a point of sociocultural interaction with people, environments, and a lens for understanding the world. And this is a theory of anti-patriarchal liberation, just to fully contextualize and give credit to Rubin. I don't want to seem like I'm bastardizing her work to talk about some video game nonsense. It just sort of informs how I assist world building on the topic of sex and gender. One of the ways that we recognize gender in the human world is through pronoun usage that correlates with our gender identity. In the Pokemon world, Pokemon are referred to with pronouns that match their sex with reliable consistency. I'm unsure if there's any specific case where any Pokemon franchise or spinoff denotes any difference between sex and gender for Pokemon. Within Pokemon, sex and gender are by and large considered the same thing, which is not exactly the same for humans in the same universe, thanks to evidence we have of Beauty Nova in Pokemon XY, who is documented to be a trans woman. The most close example I can think of to some type of evidence of transgenderism in Pokemon is the great trans Azurill debacle of 2015 Tumblr. If an Azurill is female at birth, due to the different sex ratio from Azurill to Marill, it has a 1 in 3 chance to become a Marill on evolution. So a female-sexed Marill can become a male-sexed Marill upon evolving. Many people consider this trans representation in Pokemon. After all, the Pokemon literally transitions from female to male in some cases. But the association of reproductive ability with Pokemon sex, to me, makes this an ungendered event. Female Marills are denoted as female because of their reproductive ability to create eggs with male Marills, just as the inverse is true for male Marills with female Marills. A female Azurill developing the reproductive capability to mate with female Marills upon evolution seems to me to be more of an animal's development of a new reproductive organ, and is still not really indicative in any way of Pokemon gender. And I haven't played Scarlet and Violet, so I don't know if it at all contends with sex and gender for Pokemon. A cursory Google search says no, but who knows. But from my understanding, there are no mainline or spin-off games that concretely parse out the gender of Pokemon from their sex and reproductive capability. There's no statement on Pokemon gender, it is just sex and reproductive capability. In fact, when Pokemon characters talk about the symbols next to their Pokemon's names in battle, they refer to it as the Pokemon's gender in most cases. People see that they have a female Marill and they call it the Pokemon's gender. If there's no distinguishment between sex and gender, they might as well be the same thing, right? Question mark? So then there's one more wrinkle that I'll introduce to this, and then I promise we'll get to Pokemon Mystery Dungeon eventually, but we have to talk about the move Attract if we're talking about gender and sex and reproduction in Pokemon, right? So as the sex of Pokemon is determined on the basis of their reproductive capability and their ability to mate with one another, there's not any allowance for same-sex attraction among Pokemon in the game's coding. The Pokemon move Attract allows for Pokemon to charm the opposite sex in some way, with the move description from Scarlet and Violet stating, if the target is of the opposite gender to the user, it becomes infatuated with the user and will sometimes be unable to use its moves. There are a lot of things to contend with just in that. This is a Pokemon move predicated on some level of attraction among Pokemon, no? What's interesting is that Pokemon are able to use this move on each other regardless of their ability to actually reproduce with one another. A female Skitty can use Attract on a male Gardevoir, for instance, despite the fact that no eggs can ever be produced by those two being attracted to each other, because they're in different egg groups. So then, what is this move saying about sex and gender and Pokemon? That sex is more than just reproductive ability, and there's some gender attraction link that is universal to all Pokemon? That there's no possibility of same-sex relationships in Pokemon Union? That the move Attract draws on some type of brain manipulation only possible through opposite-sex pheromones or something? I honestly have no idea what the resolution is here, to be honest. I'm introducing this proverbial newborn child of an idea to then abandon it in a forest glade without knowledge of its parentage. I'm sorry. I'll revisit Attract in Pokemon Mystery Dungeon later, obviously, but it doesn't really have clarification to this point, so we really just say a bunch of nonsense and keep it pushing. I don't know. So what we have so far in Pokemon is that there is a biological sex to almost every Pokemon, which denotes their reproductive capability, and those with no reproductive capability, i.e. legendaries, do not have sexes because they are biologically incapable of reproduction. And all of this had to be established before we got to Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Blue Rescue Team for a reason. In this game, Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, no Pokemon is gendered. And while I argued that none of them are realistically gendered in the earthly human sense in mainline Pokemon games, I'm intentionally bearing the lead with that, because in this game, Pokemon aren't sexed either. There's no marker on any Pokemon's bio denoting that they are male or female, nor are they able to reproduce within the game's context. And that matters significantly. Pokemon in PMD BRT, wow, there really is not a seamless acronym for this game, occasionally refer to each other with pronouns, a typical human way to gender one another. In this world, with the only specific example I'm able to think of right now being how Gengar is called him towards the end of the game. Yet the player character and deuteragonist partner character are never referred to with any gendered pronouns throughout the scope of the game. I admit I'm not a good enough YouTuber to pull the Japanese text and make sure that's true in the original language the game was written in, but I'm going to go off what I assume was the developer's intention, to make it deliberately vague so that any player of any gender identity wouldn't feel like they were not represented by the story. Okay, really quick, I am recording this part after I finished the script, but I forgot completely that there was a remake of Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Blue Rescue Team. I was so scared. I had already written this whole script. Anyways, the good news is that it doesn't completely invalidate anything. There is still no gender and sex in the remake. However, from my friend who has played it, they said that there is there's a pronoun usage for the player character and the partner character. They're both referred to with he, him pronouns. So that's significant, and that sort of plays into the rest of this video, but just something to acknowledge. I did not think to look at the remake, but it does not disprove my video. Pokemon Mystery Dungeon takes place in some type of Pokemon-exclusive enclave of the world, and though it seems that humans have some history on this Pokemon planet, there's no human presence felt anywhere materially or culturally throughout the game's plot. Society is organized by, for, and exclusively to Pokemon themselves. The protagonist, a human turned Pokemon, interacts with the environments as an outsider for a significant portion of the game, and it's clear that the player controlling them and the protagonist themselves are both experiencing first times in this Pokemon universe together. So in Pokemon worlds with humans present, there's an understanding of sex, and in a Pokemon world with humans absent, there's no understanding of sex. I have to assume that this is in some way connected. The one instance we see of a Pokemon organized society with no top-down presence of trainers orchestrating a hierarchy of power has no reference to sex whatsoever. The only difference we can even point to understand why sex is absent is the absence of humans in this world. It's time to circle back to Attract as well, which functions with complete and 100% accuracy regardless of who it's used on in Pokémon Mystery Dungeon, as none of the Pokemon are sexed anyways. I never tested it on legendaries, who are mostly immune to statuses anyway in the game, but on most of the standard Pokemon, you're able to infatuate them without regard for what would be their sex in a mainline game. So then, if we take the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Blue Rescue Team mechanics as canon, Attract cannot be foundationally about some biological incompatibility of reproduction of opposite-sex Pokemon, and instead the move must be some socio-cultural attempts at influencing the brain through attraction. And that means that attraction among Pokemon is fluid and not bound by sex, or what some people would call gender if the Pokemon organize their society with any regard for gender. What does that say? It says that the reason why mainline Pokemon's move Attract functions the way it does is because humans have imposed a system of sex understanding on their Pokemon. There's a level of top-down control creating sexuality in Pokemon through reproductive coercion. When the human-Pokemon hierarchy is removed from the Pokemon world, so too is the idea of sex-based attraction and sex-gender association. And while some might argue that the absence of sex markers in Pokemon Mystery Dungeon is merely a gameplay choice, this omission significantly impacts how the game represents Pokemon society. By removing human-imposed sex and gender systems, the game suggests a society where these concepts are irrelevant or unnecessary still functioning. The Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Blue Rescue Team Society is ordered based on collectivity, community, and shared stewardship for their environment. And as was just mentioned in the section on criminality, hierarchy has to be recreated in a new way to create conflict in the narrative, because the usual hierarchical power order is impossible without humans to be the apex of the proverbial pyramid of power. Could it be that a society without the hierarchy of humans to Pokemon does not necessitate Pokemon to be sexed, because the imposition of sex and reproduction onto Pokemon is a means of subjugation? In other words, the relationship between human and Pokemon is subjugator and subjugated, and in a world where the subjugated are liberated from the subjugator, the assignments of the subjugator to the subjugated are removed. In other words, sex is irrelevant to Pokemon existence when humans are not involved in their lives. Let's think about it this way. Pokemon's lifespans are mostly unknown to players of the games, but we know that Pokemon life is in some ways different due to the evolutionary cycle and the very sparse references to Pokemon death we see throughout the games. To reproduce has to mean something different to Pokemon, with mysterious and perhaps in some cases infinite lifespans, than to humans who have a biologically finite amount of time on the Earth and a tangible life cycle. I think it's fair to assume Pokemon can probably die of old age, but the idea that they must be tangibly separated from each other by their reproductive capability and sexes is only necessary if there has to be a continual supply of new Pokemon being created at a rate faster than the ability of Pokemon to die off. And that would only be something that humans would impose on Pokemon, because reproduction is not a substantial part of any wild Pokemon lore in the media we have available. All the eggs we see in the anime, to my knowledge, are produced by human Pokemon breeders. It's not clear how Pokemon in the wild find each other and reproduce unless humans are there to make eggs in the daycare. There are a lot of strands here, and a lot of things to tie together, but if we talk about the relationship of human to Pokemon and the relationship of human to Pokemon to the sex of Pokemon, inevitably we have to address the two human-turned-Pokemon characters in the narrative, the protagonist and Gengar. The protagonist arrives and is known as a human from the outset of the game and is adopted into Pokemon society accordingly. They navigate the world in the physical body of a Pokemon and are conflicted between wanting to find a way home and wanting to stay in the Pokemon universe. Interestingly, A Legend of a Human Turned into a Pokemon as a Curse spans the middle section of the game, even though there are no humans evident in the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon universe. In a twist, this is Gengar, as Gengar is made into a Pokemon as punishment, whereas the protagonist is made into a Pokemon to save the world. Where, then, are all the rest of the humans? One of the friend areas in this game is used as evidence by some Mystery Dungeon fans to say that the humankind's existence is in the past tense. The decrepit lab states, "An abandoned lab built by humans long ago, left to fall into disrepair, it is now home to Pokemon." And I don't want to quite go into sequels or future installments of the franchise yet, but I think this combines with the idea proposed in the final moments about how the protagonist was selected from the, quote, human world to become a Pokemon and be the one savior is something important. It's probably fair to assume that there is no secret society of humans hiding away in a corner of the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon universe, and we can call this a post-human world in many respects. So if humankind are responsible for sexing Pokemon, how can two humans exist in the Pokemon world as Pokemon without bringing sex with them? From my perspective, the imposition of sex onto Pokemon can only occur through humans having power and control. There's no way for a human-turned Pokemon, for example, to impose top-down reproductive control over other Pokemon, and thus they cannot impose sex without a pervasive amount of influence over Pokemon society to do it. The game starts with the protagonist being introduced to an unsexed society, and for that protagonist to revolutionize and create a sex-gender system would rely on more than the protagonist has capacity to do within the game's storyline. After all, a sizable portion of that storyline has the protagonist expelled from the town for being a human, and thus any human perspective on how to, quote, reform Pokemon society was totally unwelcome. Gengar, interestingly enough, has some type of status in the Pokemon Society from the start of the game, but the members of the society are completely unaware that he's a human. Could he enact a sex-gender system if he wanted to? After all, he's also the steward of the afterlife, apparently, and presumably with that type of power comes a certain level of control. I don't think it's that simple, though. The protagonist and Gengar in Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Blue Rescue Team, despite their origins as humans, are unable to impose that sex-gender system on the Pokémon society they find themselves in. This inability is deeply tied to the dynamics of power and subjugation. As humans were transformed into Pokémon, they enter the world not as natural subjugators, but as equals, or even as outsiders among the Pokémon. This fundamentally challenges their capacity to recreate the hierarchical structures of power, including those related to sex and gender that they may have known as humans. In the human world, the sex-gender system is a tool of control, a means by which power is maintained through the regulation of reproductive capabilities and the enforcement of a binary that defines roles and identities, namely the patriarchy. However, in the world of Pokémon Mystery Dungeon, the absence of humans has led to the abolition, or at least the disappearance of this system. The hierarchical relationship between human and Pokemon, where humans exert control and define the terms of existence for Pokemon, has been eradicated. As a result, the societal structures that enabled sex-based reproductive control, and indeed, sex at all, are rendered impossible. As I mentioned before, the idea of criminality and ferality that Pokémon Mystery Dungeon presents sort of adds a wrinkle to this idea of liberation as what may seem through the abolition of sex. Perhaps the hierarchy of ferality versus civilized society is even a compelling reason that the protagonist and Gengar are not able to impose sex onto Pokemon society. There's very little preventing the protagonist and Gengar from being cast into a mystery dungeon to live out their days with the label of wild, just as what happens to the protagonist in the middle of the game. Although the subjugator-subjugated relationship between human and Pokemon, and indeed human and Pokemon reproduction, has been dismantled, it still replicates itself within the socio-cultural and territorial political system, casting mystery dungeons as lawless lands for vigilante intervention. The relationship between subjugator and subjugated in Pokémon Mystery Dungeon is the relationship between civilized Pokémon and quote-unquote wild Pokémon in Mystery Dungeons. Within Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Blue Rescue Team, the unity and collectivity of a Pokémon organized society manifests in some ways and is, in other ways, a smokescreen to how far away liberation is. As long as Pokémon are still cast at the margins of society and chased down in mystery dungeons, i.e. areas of disorder and low resources, there can be no celebration of the dismantling of sex-based reproductive control. After all, how do we know there's no reproductive abuse from those in society towards those out of society? There is no narrative perspective given to these quote-unquote feral Pokemon to self-identify or explain how culture is formed within a mystery dungeon. And thus, as we start to understand how the socio-cultural conditions of Pokemon Mystery Dungeon's world emerge, we must recognize that our understanding is still incomplete and will remain incomplete because the game didn't intend for itself to be analyzed this way. What the game does posit is that a society organized by and for Pokemon has substantial differences to one organized by humans with Pokemon in mind. And while Pokemon are able to find a sense of unity and shared sense of belonging among each other free from some of the trappings of humankind, it is an imperfect and conditional unity, with Pokemon excluded from that collective based on either interpersonal conflict or sociocultural norms. What I read from Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Blue Rescue Team was a society that teetered between societal liberation and marginalization, where a strong and influential force could tip the scales to either side. Under the threat of a slowly eroding world, certain Pokemon, but not all of them, came together to save that world and reprieve it from destruction. These are the perfect conditions for a Pokemon who has gained status as the hero of the world to exploit the discord and push this Pokemon-organized society to reintroduce a sex-gender system as a new mode of hierarchy for subjugation. And as we know from future installments, the non-sexed identities in Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Blue Rescue Team are gone by the sequels Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Explorers of Darkness, Time, Sky, and Beyond. Could it be that the only humans we knew existed in Blue Rescue Team used the events of the game as a launching pad to then plunge the Pokemon world back into rigid categorization, setting the stage for the reemergence of reproductive control and indeed the sexing of the Pokemon worlds? Could it be that the protagonist and Gengar played a significant role in the reformation of society around sexes and genders, using their roles as humans turned Pokemon to advocate for a system that will end up doing exponentially more harm? That'll have to be for another video. Let me know if you want me to extend my analysis to those games, or maybe even the future Mystery Dungeon games beyond that, because I'm always down for a replay, and I do have a working thesis about it already, but I don't know. As I said in my last video, I'm new to YouTube and video essaying, so if you have any thoughts on how to improve my videos, please let me know. And honestly, let me know if you hated every part of this, because comment rage probably helps me in the algorithm or something. I'm trying to do a vague once-a-month schedule for the time being, but it might be a while for my next video because I have no idea what to make it, and I'm not playing anything necessarily video essayable right now, but we'll see. Anyways, I'm Shoofleas, Pokemon are better at organizing society than humans, and I'll see y'all later. Peace.